Hey guys, tonight we begin with something painful, poetic, and incredibly strange. The justice system of the Aztec Empire, a civilization known for its pyramids, precision, calendars, and yes, blood-soaked rituals. The Aztecs didn't just sacrifice people for religion. They also had a legal system, one filled with punishments that were as creative as they were terrifying. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine stealing food and being dragged naked through the city while chili powder is rubbed into your wounds, or being forced to inhale smoke until you passed out, all because you cut down the wrong tree. These weren't the acts of a madman. This was Aztec law, and in their world, punishment was both performance and policy. So, what were some of the strangest, most brutal, and occasionally hilarious ways the Aztecs kept order? Let's begin. When people think of the Aztec Empire, they often picture heart sacrifices, blood-soaked pyramids, and priests with obsidian knives. Not exactly a civilization known for its warm approach to human resources. But here's the thing. The Aztecs didn't just swing blades at anyone who annoyed them. They had a legal system, and it was surprisingly organized, sophisticated even. Brutal, absolutely, but not chaotic. Aztec justice had rules, codes, and a structure that would make your HOA jealous. Laws were written into a code, known as the Huhidi, a set of wise sayings and instructions that covered everything, from marriage and market conduct to how not to die painfully in public. These laws were passed down through generations, and while there weren't any leather-bound law books, there were judges, actual specialized officials who took their jobs very seriously. No powdered wigs, just stern faces and an excellent memory for punishment options. And yes, they had appeals courts. You could argue your case to higher judges, though your chances were slim if the community already saw you as that guy who stole the corn twice. Judges were often priests or elder nobles, people considered wise, experienced, and highly trained in the legal traditions. They weren't above taking bribes, sure, but if you were caught bribing them, you could be executed. So really, everyone played the game carefully. What made Aztec justice truly unique was its mix of morality and pageantry. Justice wasn't just served, it was performed. Punishments were designed to teach lessons, not quietly behind closed doors, but loudly, publicly, and often with props. You didn't just pay a fine for a crime. You were shaved, painted, dragged, or symbolically transformed into a warning poster with legs. And here's the most Aztec part. Some punishments changed depending on your social class. Nobles were held to higher standards and harsher punishments. A commoner might be fined or flogged. A noble who did the same thing could lose land, titles, or his head. So no, Aztec justice wasn't random. It was sharp, stylish, public, and a little theatrical. And if you broke the law, the empire made sure you never forgot it, and neither did your neighbors. So, you've broken a law in the Aztec Empire. Maybe you drank pulque underage. Maybe you stole a basket of maize. Or maybe, and let's hope not, you cut down a sacred tree. Whatever your crime, you're about to meet the Aztec court system. Don't bother calling your lawyer. There aren't any. The Aztec courts were highly structured, but not exactly what you'd call cozy. Think more stone platform, surrounded by stern men in feathered cloaks than cozy courtroom drama. The trial would take place publicly, often in a plaza or temple court, and it wasn't designed for theatrics unless you count the part where someone might be shaved, painted, or whipped in front of a crowd. Cases were typically heard by judges known as Claxotin, wise elders, or noblemen trained in the laws and customs of the empire. They weren't just randomly assigned. They had to study for years, memorize large sections of law code, and learn how to spot a liar from 10 paces away. You didn't argue with them unless you really like the sound of public flogging. The accused could defend themselves, and sometimes a family member or elder might speak on their behalf. But let's be honest, unless you were incredibly persuasive or very, very lucky, things probably weren't leaning in your favor. There were witnesses, evidence, and even multiple courts, including a high court and an emperor-level appeal. Yes, you could take your case all the way to the top, but the journey there was rough. And if the emperor decided you were guilty, well, let's just say there wouldn't be much paperwork afterward. One thing you'll notice quickly, the Aztecs didn't believe in dragging things out. No long trials, no years of debate. Judgments came fast and punishment often came the same day. That's efficiency. Terrifying skin. Peeling efficiency. Also no jails. Aztec society didn't warehouse criminals. You were either fined, humiliated, enslaved, or executed. And sometimes all four, but you were never forgotten. Aztec courts weren't about legal rights or clever technicalities. They were about moral clarity, social order, and public spectacle. So if you're standing before an Aztec judge, straighten up, speak carefully, and try not to sweat too obviously. They notice that sort of thing. In most cultures, kids who misbehave get a timeout or maybe a stern lecture. In the Aztec Empire, they got something a little more intense. Meet the chili smoke chamber, possibly history's most dramatic method of saying, listen to your mother. In Aztec households, obedience wasn't optional. Children were expected to work, listen, respect their elders, and contribute to the home. The idea was simple. Train them early to be good citizens, hard workers, and future warriors or weavers. And if little Cuauhtémoc didn't want to sweep the floor or dared to talk back, he got the chili. The punishment was called Cleal Shelley, and it involved placing the disobedient child in a small enclosed space such as a hut or storage room where chilies had been thrown onto a fire. As they burned, the room filled with a smoke so intense it made your eyes burn, your throat close up, and your sinuses scream. Think pepper spray, but with spiritual intent. The child wasn't harmed physically, at least not permanently, but the experience was unforgettable. They weren't beaten, bruised, or bloodied. Instead, they were overwhelmed. The sensory overload of chili vapor did the job of several hours of parental yelling in just a few minutes. And the goal wasn't cruelty. It was shame-based conditioning. Once you've coughed up your will to misbehave, you're unlikely to sass your parents again, at least until your voice comes back. Other punishments for children included being pricked with cactus spines, forced to sweep temples in public, or made to carry bundles of firewood beyond their strength. These acts weren't about humiliation for fun. They were rites of correction. And in a society where every person had a social duty, discipline wasn't negotiable. Even noble children weren't spared. In fact, they were held to higher standards. The Aztec Empire had one of the most unforgiving views of theft in the ancient world. Stealing wasn't just a moral failing. It was an attack on the structure of society. Food, tools, cloth, firewood, it all had value. And taking what wasn't yours didn't just offend your neighbor, it offended the gods. And the punishment? Let's just say, the Aztecs weren't into subtlety. For first-time offenders, things started reasonably. A thief might be forced to return the stolen goods, make reparations, or be publicly shamed. Maybe a few lashes. Maybe a haircut that said, I steal things. Painful but survivable. But if you stole again, you entered the realm of enslavement. The Aztecs didn't do prisons. They preferred that you work off your debt. Quite literally caught a second time, and you might be handed over to the victim as a personal servant. You'd labor in silence, dignity gone, every step, reminding you that honesty would have been easier. Now, if you were bold and or foolish enough to steal a third time, things turned gruesome. Punishment 3 was often ritual skinning, not quick, not clean, and absolutely not private. It was slow, ceremonial, and publicly displayed. This wasn't just about pain. It was about Symbolism. The skin was considered a sacred layer, a part of your identity. To remove it was to unmake you in the eyes of the community. Sometimes the skin was removed in strips, other times whole. And it wasn't just thrown away. In religious ceremonies, a priest might even wear the skin for a brief time in honor of the earth goddess, representing rebirth and punishment all in one macabre package. Sound horrifying? It was. And that was the point. This kind of justice wasn't just about the individual. It was about the message. A skin thief in the market square stopped 1,000 future crimes. It made you think twice before swiping tamales or slipping a jade bead into your tunic. The Aztecs believed in law, in consequence, and in the power of example. And their message was clear. Steal once, we'll warn you. Steal twice, we'll work you. Steal 3 times, you won't be needing your skin. In the Aztec Empire, marriage was serious business. Not just a social contract, but a sacred bond tied to cosmic balance, family, honor, and economic alliances. So when someone broke that bond with a little romantic, extracurricular activity, the punishment was not divorce court. It was death by blunt object. Let's begin with the basics. Adultery wasn't treated as a private scandal. It was a capital crime, publicly prosecuted and severely punished. And it wasn't just men who got to point fingers. Women could accuse, too. But if you were caught, the empire didn't do therapy. If a man was found sleeping with another man's wife, the husband had options. And none of them involved second chances. The most common penalty, public execution, often by bludgeoning with a stone club, a heavy instrument called a mekua whittle. It was a sword-like weapon embedded with obsidian blades. But for domestic dishonor, the blunt version got the job done painfully and thoroughly. Sometimes the punishment wasn't left to the courts. In certain cases, the wronged spouse could carry out the sentence personally. Talk about closure. Women caught cheating faced equally grim fates. Death by strangulation, stoning, or being thrown off a cliff were all on the table depending on the region and the exact nature of the betrayal. Nobles, of course, were held to stricter standards because when the wealthy cheat, it's not just scandal. It's potential dynastic collapse. And let's not forget the drama. If the affair was exposed publicly, the accused might be paraded through the streets, mocked, shaved, painted, all before meeting their final punishment. Shame was not a side effect. It was part of the sentence. Now, if someone accused you falsely, that was another story. Lying about adultery could get you executed as well. The Aztecs didn't tolerate character assassination unless it came with evidence, and they took witness testimony seriously. So, no rumor mongering for revenge unless you liked playing with obsidian. At the heart of it all, Aztec marriage was a sacred institution, and violating it wasn't just a moral slip, it was an insult to society, gods, and law. So if you ever wondered whether ancient civilizations cared about monogamy in the Aztec Empire, the answer was yes, to death. You've heard of being punished for theft, murder, even adultery. But what about cutting down the wrong tree? In the Aztec Empire, some trees weren't just wood with leaves. They were sacred. They represented the gods, the ancestors, or the very balance of nature. And if you, in your infinite wisdom, decided to chop one down for firewood, well, say goodbye to your house, possibly your dignity, too. Certain trees, especially those planted near temples, marketplaces, or shrines, were considered protected by divine right. Damaging one was seen as a spiritual offense, not just an act of vandalism. You weren't just hurting nature. You were insulting the cosmic order. The punishment for a first offense. You might be publicly beaten, often with cactus spines or thorny branches. Yes, they made nature punish you with itself. Poetic justice with a prickly edge. But that wasn't the worst of it. In many cases, you'd also be forced to pay restitution in the form of goods, labor, or even losing your home. Your property could be confiscated or burned. And in some regions, the offending tree cutter was paraded through the town while villagers hurled insults and occasionally pebbles. The idea wasn't just to hurt you physically. It was to let everyone know this idiot messed with the gods' landscaping. And if you were a repeat offender, you might be enslaved, especially if the tree you harmed was near a sacred site. Because, apparently, if you couldn't respect the roots of a tree, you didn't deserve roots of your own. To modern ears, it might sound absurd, punished for trimming a branch. But to the Aztecs, this was serious. Nature wasn't passive. It was alive, sacred, and deeply connected to the divine. Trees, rivers, mountains, they weren't resources. They were relatives, and harming them without permission was like slapping your grandmother and hoping nobody noticed. So, yes, if you lived in the Aztec Empire, you needed to know your bot laws. That tree outside your neighbor's house, better ask first. The shady one, in the marketplace, definitely don't touch it, because in this world, ignorance isn't bliss. It's just flammable property and bruises from thorns. In most cultures, teenage drinking ends with a lecture, a bad hangover, or a very awkward ride home with your parents. In the Aztec Empire, it ended with execution. Let's get one thing straight. The Aztecs weren't anti-alcohol. They had a beloved sacred drink called pulque, made from the fermented sap of the megri plant. It was frothy, slightly sour, and loaded with ritual significance. Pulque was used in religious ceremonies, festivals, and even funeral rites. For adults, especially elders and priests, it was considered medicinal and divine. But if you were a teenager, one sip was a death sentence. Young Aztecs were expected to be disciplined, respectful, and absolutely sober. Pulque was for those who had earned it through battle, age, or wisdom. Youth was a time for learning, not partying. And drunkenness among teens wasn't just frowned upon. It was seen as moral collapse. So if a teenager was caught drinking, the punishment was swift and harsh. A first-time offender might be shaved bald, a mark of shame. Sometimes they were paraded naked through the streets while villagers hurled insults or trash. A mobile reminder that good choices are better than fermented ones. But for repeat offenders, the sentence escalated fast. Execution by strangulation or beating, often in public. The method wasn't designed for drama. It was designed for memory. One teenager hanging from a pole was all it took to sober up the rest of the neighborhood for a generation. Even noble-born youth weren't spared. In fact, they were held to stricter standards. A prince caught drinking might face ritual humiliation in the royal court or be sent to live in a cold remote temple as punishment. The message privilege doesn't excuse foolishness. Why so severe? Because the Aztecs saw drunkenness as a kind of spiritual rot, a gateway to laziness, disrespect, and disobedience. And in a civilization that depended on order, discipline, and cosmic balance, a tipsy teen was a ticking time bomb. So next time you imagine a wild Aztec party, remember, unless you were old, high-ranking, or involved in a funeral, your pulque cup stayed dry. Otherwise, your throat wouldn't. In the Aztec Empire, work wasn't just a chore. It was a virtue, a sacred expectation, a civic duty written into the social fabric. Everyone from commoner to noble had a role to play in the great cosmic machine. So, what happened if you didn't pull your weight? Let's put it this way. You'd be working again very soon. Just not by choice. Laziness, idleness, slacking off. These weren't treated as personality quirks. They were considered offenses against the gods, particularly Tlaloc, god of rain and agriculture, and Tezcatlipoca, who kept a sharp eye on moral behavior. The gods didn't give you good harvests, so you could nap in the shade. If you disrespected the order of labor, the Aztecs made sure you'd feel the consequences. If a man refused to work, refused to help his family, or consistently ignored his civic duties, he could be dragged into the marketplace and publicly shamed. His head might be shaved, his clothes replaced with rags. In some cases, he'd be forced to wear rotten garments or carry bundles of firewood through the town while people shouted things like, "Behold the man who does nothing. But that was the gentle version. Repeat offenders might be beaten with rods, tied to a post, or if their laziness was seen as willful defiance, sold into slavery. Not forever, but long enough to learn the lesson. You're either useful or you're used. Even noble-born youths were monitored closely. If a young man of high rank refused to train for war or skipped temple duties, his family could request that he be sent to a house of youth correction, which sounds like summer camp, but was really more like a military boot camp with cactus punishments. Laziness among women wasn't ignored either, though women had different duties: grinding maize, weaving, tending the home. They too could be shamed for neglect. Mothers were expected to raise hardworking children, not ones who lounged around chewing maize husks. The Aztec belief was simple: idleness disrupts harmony. A lazy person risks their family's well-being, their community's balance, and the favor of the gods. So, if you were planning to lounge around the chinamper and skip your corn harvesting chores, better start running, because the punishment wouldn't be quiet, and it wouldn't be optional. In the bustling heart of the Aztec Empire, the Tianquisli, or marketplace, everything was negotiable except honesty. Selling rotten fruit, watered down pulp, or fake obsidian was not just bad business. It was criminal behavior, and the Aztecs had zero tolerance for marketplace mischief. You weren't just breaking a rule. You were betraying the gods who blessed commerce, agriculture, and fair exchange. Every seller, whether hawking tamales or trading jade, was expected to abide by strict ethical codes. Markets were sacred spaces, often overseen by special officials called pachadal, market judges, or inspectors. Their job: walk among the stalls, listen for complaints, and catch people slipping pebbles into their chili powder. If you got caught selling spoiled goods, punishment was swift and very public. A first-time offense might involve public shaming, your stall overturned, your produce scattered, and your hands bound for everyone to see. Shoppers would walk past and spit insults like, "There goes the liar with wormy avocados," selling something falsely advertised. Say dyed feathers labeled as sacred. Quetzal plumes was even worse. That could get you beaten, fined, or in extreme cases, banished from the market altogether. And in a society where markets were your lifeline, banishment wasn't a timeout. It was economic death. Repeat offenders could be enslaved or branded, marked so future buyers knew never to trust your mangoes again. If your fraud caused real harm, like selling toxic herbs as medicine, you might even face execution, especially if the victim was of noble status. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about protecting trust. The market was where communities met, families survived, and tribute flowed. If buyers stopped trusting sellers, the entire structure began to crumble. That couldn't be allowed. Even sellers of sacred goods, incense, ceremonial textiles, or idols were watched closely. If a temple merchant was caught selling low-quality items for high tribute prices, they weren't just scamming people. They were cheating the gods. And the gods didn't give refunds. They gave plagues. So if you thought you could hustle your way through the market with a painted corn cob and a charming smile, think again. Because in Tenochtitlan, the phrase "buyer beware" came with a very sharp edge. If you ever found yourself standing in an Aztec courtroom, surrounded by elders in feathered cloaks and facing judgment under the piercing gaze of a priest judge, here's one golden rule: do not lie. Seriously, don't embellish. Don't misremember. And absolutely don't invent your own version of the truth. Because in the Aztec Empire, false testimony wasn't just unethical, it was deadly. The Aztecs held truth as a sacred principle, not just a courtroom courtesy. Telling the truth meant upholding order, harmony, and divine balance. Lies, on the other hand, corrupted the social structure and offended the gods, especially Tezlip. Poker, the god of night, judgment, and truth. He didn't appreciate your creative storytelling. Court trials depended heavily on witness testimony. There were no security Cameras, no forensic labs, just your word against someone else's. And that word carried serious weight. So when you lied in court, you weren't just tipping the scales. You were potentially sending someone to their death or enslavement. Unjustly, the punishment for perjury, execution, often by strangulation, stoning, or being clubbed to death, depending on the region and the severity of your deceit. If the lie was proven after the trial and your false words led to someone else's suffering, you'd often be made to suffer the same fate you caused them. It was poetic justice, with sharp edges. Even lesser lies came with serious consequences. Public beatings, banishment, or ritual humiliation could follow. You might be painted black, the color of deceit, or shaved bald and paraded through the market with a sign around your neck, reading something like, "Talks too much, tells too little truth." False accusers weren't just punished for lying. They were seen as threats to society itself, willing to manipulate justice, harm others, and risk divine anger for selfish gain. Aztec law wasn't about technicalities. It was about moral clarity, and in their eyes, truth was sacred, binding, and non-negotiable. So if you ever stood in the plaza accused of a crime and thought a small fib might get you off the hook, remember, in the Aztec Empire, the truth could set you free, but a lie, it could bury you. The Aztecs believed in second chances, just not very many of them. Their legal system was harsh, but not heartless. A first offense might earn you a warning, a fine, or a good public flogging to help you remember the lesson. A second time, and you'd face something more intense, maybe public humiliation, servitude, or the loss of your possessions. But a third offense, that's when things got serious, like ritual execution. Serious. To the Aztecs, repeated crimes weren't just a nuisance. They were proof that you had refused to live in balance. And balance in Aztec worldview was everything. The crops grew because society worked. The sun rose because people obeyed their roles. So when someone broke the law again and again, they weren't just annoying, they were a threat to cosmic order. Let's say you were a thief. First time you return the goods. Second time you're enslaved. Third time you're skinned slowly in public with the full backing of the law, and very possibly the neighborhood. Or maybe you lied in court. Again, the punishment wasn't just harsher than before. It was symbolic. Your repeated dishonesty made you inhuman in the eyes of society. And what happens to those who lose their humanity? They become examples, warnings, cautionary tales. And it wasn't just about physical punishment. Repeat offenders could lose their legal protection entirely. That meant anyone could harm, enslave, or publicly shame you. And you had no legal recourse. You weren't exiled. You weren't imprisoned. You were unpersoned. In some cases, a repeat offender could be permanently banished from the market, the village, or even their own family. Imagine being spiritually erased, not because the gods abandoned you, but because you abandoned the social contract one too many times. To the Aztecs, lawbreakers weren't inherently evil. They were correctable. But repeat offenders were something worse, unwilling to learn. And in a society where justice was public, swift, and divine, the state didn't waste time on those who refused to be rehabilitated. So if you got caught once, you were lucky. Twice, you were warned. But if you stood in that courtroom a third time, you were already gone. In modern justice systems, punishment often happens behind closed doors, courtrooms, jail cells, private hearings. But in the Aztec Empire, justice was street theater. Punishment wasn't just meant for the person who broke the law. It was designed to educate everyone else. The Aztecs believed that fear and shame were tools just as important as clubs and cactus whips. If someone saw your humiliation, they'd remember it long after the pain faded, and they'd think twice before stealing that tamale. That's why almost all punishments, from flogging to execution, were carried out in the open, usually in the center of the community, the plaza, the marketplace, or outside temples. These were the places where people gathered to trade, pray, and socialize. Perfect for teaching lessons in full view of your friends, family, and enemies. Imagine this. You're caught, lying or stealing. You're dragged to the plaza. A crowd gathers. Your clothes are torn. Your head might be shaved. You're painted with black soot to mark your shame. And then the punishment begins. A beating, a binding, maybe a good chili. Smoking in a hut if you're still young. And reckless. Children who disrespected elders might be made to carry heavy bundles of wood barefoot across town. Lazy workers could be paraded with signs around their necks. Adulterers could be stoned or strangled before a sea of silent or not so silent onlookers. Public punishment wasn't random cruelty. It was a ritual of memory. The Aztecs understood human psychology. Pain fades, embarrassment echoes, and that echo kept society in line. There were no prison systems, no lifelong incarcerations. The point wasn't to disappear wrongdoers. It was to transform them or destroy them in full view. Even executions were spectacles. A thief might be flayed, not in some dark back room, but in the square where he once sold stolen goods. His punishment became a living parable for every passer by. In Aztec law, privacy was for the innocent. The guilty were meant to be seen, heard, and remembered, not just for what they did, but for what happened next. Because in this world, your real sentence wasn't just death or pain. It was becoming the lesson. In the Aztec Empire, punishment wasn't just about what you felt. It was about what you represented. It wasn't enough for you to hurt. You had to be seen, interpreted, and above all understood. Because justice in Tenochtitlan wasn't just a legal process. It was a performance. And you were the unfortunate star. Let's say you stole something. Food, tools, clothing. If it was your first offense, maybe you weren't beaten. Instead, your head was shaved, your body painted with black soot, and you were paraded around in humiliating clothes. Torn, oversized tunics or rags tied in knots that made you look ridiculous. Not physically painful, but symbolically devastating. Or say you lied in court. You might have your lips stained with charcoal to mark your deceit. Everyone would see it. Everyone would know. It didn't matter if you told the truth. Later, the stain told its own story. Even colors had meaning. Black was associated with deceit and shamered. Might mark a serious offense. Striped or dyed clothing could be reserved for public punishments. The Aztecs understood that the human eye doesn't forget what it's been trained to fear. Noble offenders were treated no differently. In fact, worse. A noble child caught drunk might be dressed as a commoner and forced to sweep temple floors, a clear inversion of his status. To an Aztec audience, that image was powerful. This is what happens when the privileged dishonor their role. Even punishment tools were symbolic. Being beaten with cactus spines was not just about the pain. It reflected the natural world's judgment. Carrying heavy bundles of firewood symbolized the burden of guilt. A shaved head didn't just look odd. It meant you'd been stripped of social dignity. The message crime wasn't a private mistake. It was a public rupture, a disruption in the sacred flow of order. And to heal it, society needed not just consequences, but images that endured, living reminders that law and morality were deeply intertwined. In short, Aztec punishment was a play, a visual story designed to be retold through gossip, song, and frightened memory. You weren't just a criminal. You were now a symbol. In most societies, punishment often ends behind bars. Time served, walls built, a sentence measured in months or years. But in the Aztec Empire, there were no prisons. Why? Because the Aztecs didn't believe in storing problems. They solved them quickly, publicly, and very often permanently. To the Aztec mind, punishment wasn't about removing someone from society. It was about returning them to ordering them from the world altogether. There was no need to feed a prisoner, build a jail, or fund a guard system. Time wasn't the consequence. Shame, pain, or death was. If you stole, you might be enslaved and forced to work off your crime. But you didn't disappear. You remained in society as a cautionary example. If you lied, you wore the symbols of deceit on your body. If you committed a serious offense, the Punishment came swiftly with the community watching and the gods invoked. And if you couldn't be corrected, if you were a repeat offender, a danger to others, or simply defiant, then your story ended not behind a door with iron bars, but in the marketplace, the plaza, or the temple. Steps with no need for parole. Even noble prisoners such as captured enemy, rulers, or high-ranking criminals weren't jailed. They were housed temporarily in ritual captivity, treated according to status until their scheduled execution or sacrifice. Their time wasn't served. It was counted down. There were, however, small holding rooms, not prisons, but places to detain someone briefly before their punishment. These were sparse, guarded by warriors, and not used for rehabilitation. You weren't sent there to change. You were sent there to wait. This system worked because Aztec law relied on immediacy and visibility. Delayed punishment weakened its impact. Invisible punishment, like imprisonment, robbed society of the lesson. And in Aztec eyes, the lesson was the most important part. So while other civilizations built towers to hide their criminals, the Aztecs built rituals to remind you, break the order, and the consequences will be swift, public, and unforgettable. Because in this empire, they didn't need bars. They had balance. By now, you've probably noticed. The Aztec Empire didn't believe in second chances for long. Their punishments were swift, symbolic, and often painful. And that was exactly the point. Because to the Aztecs, the purpose of justice wasn't rehabilitation. It was remembrance. Every punishment, whether it was a chili, smoked sauna, a cactus whipping, or being flayed in the plaza, was designed to etch the crime into collective memory. For the offender, for the bystanders, for the entire community. A culture without prisons relied on something much stronger. Fear, shame, and the kind of storytelling that starts with, "You'll never believe what I saw in the marketplace today." And that's what made the Aztec legal system so effective and so terrifying. It forced people to remember, because if you didn't, you might not live long enough to forget. The entire society was wired for moral clarity. Children were taught early that wrongdoing brought not only pain, but spectacle. Adults knew that crime wasn't just a personal failure. It was a cosmic imbalance. The gods didn't want lengthy court cases. They wanted action, and the empire delivered. But here's the twist. For all its brutality, the system worked, at least for them. Social order was maintained. Markets ran smoothly. Children were respectful. Priests weren't pickpocketed during ceremonies. And if you ever thought about breaking a rule, all it took was one glance at the guy with the shaved head and suits, smeared face limping past you, and suddenly you remembered the rules quite clearly. The Aztecs didn't just punish, they performed morality. Every crime was an opportunity for education. Every consequence was theater. You learn not by reading a scroll, but by witnessing a punishment you never wanted to experience yourself. And if you couldn't learn, well, the system had room for that too. In a society without long-term prisons, non-learners were recycled into warnings. You either remembered the rules or you didn't survive long enough to break them again. That was Aztec justice. Swift, symbolic, and unforgettable in all the ways that mattered. Before she was the scourge of Roman merchants and the symbol of seaborne defiance, Chota was a woman, navigating the brutal politics of a rising Aryan kingdom. She didn't inherit her throne in peace. She married it as the wife of King Agrin of the Ardir tribe, one of the most powerful Aryan coalitions on the eastern Adriatic coast. Tudor entered a world dominated by warlords, smugglers, and maritime raiders. Agrin was a formidable king, known for his military ambition and expansionist campaigns. Under his leadership, Uria became a naval force to be feared. But in 231 BCE, his sudden death from illness or perhaps a drinking binge, depending on which ancient gossip you believe, left the throne in a precarious position, and Tudor stepped in not as a grieving widow, but as the regent, commander for her underage stepson, Pines. This was not a ceremonial position. Tudor didn't sit behind silk curtains waiting for advisors. She took the reins of power and, more importantly, of the Navy. Her rule came at a time when piracy wasn't just tolerated. It was practically a national pastime. Irian pirates weren't criminals in the eyes of their own people. They were the backbone of the local economy. They raided merchant ships, demanded tribute, and controlled key trade routes through the Adriatic and Ionian seas. Under Tut's regency, piracy didn't just continue. It expanded. She encouraged it, licensed it, and defended it fiercely. To her, it was a legitimate form of warfare, and to many Irians, it was an honorable profession. Tudor knew what she was doing. In a world where Athens had faded and Rome hadn't yet fully reached across the sea, she saw a vacuum, and she filled it with Irian sails. But while she may have had the Adriatic under control, her boldness would soon provoke a power that didn't take kindly to maritime interference. Rome, slowly but confidently expanding its reach, was watching. And as Irian piracy bled into Roman trade routes, Toyota's reign would no longer be a local affair. It would become an international problem, one that Romans decided needed a very permanent solution. The Queen of the Rocks and Sea had stirred a giant. Tutair's pirates weren't just raiding isolated merchant boats. They were striking at Roman convoys, demanding tribute from Greek cities under Roman protection, and even plundering ports along the western coastline. To Rome, this wasn't piracy. It was an insult, and Romans were not famous for letting insults go unanswered. By 230 BCE, Te Roman senators had had enough. The Senate dispatched a formal diplomatic mission to Toyota's court, a warning cloaked in diplomacy, but with a blade behind the back. The lead ambassador, a Roman named Lucius Caranius, was known for his bluntness. His instructions were clear. Tell the Irian queen to stop the piracy, or Rome would take action. When the delegation arrived, they were likely met in Skadra, Tut's capital. Imagine the scene. Marble columns, Irian guards with crested helmets, and a queen seated not in fear, but in full command. Tudor welcomed them, but when they delivered Rome's message, her response was frosty. She gave them the kind of answer only a monarch with salt in her veins would give. In her own words, as later recorded by Roman historians, she claimed that Irian kings had always permitted their subjects to make a living however they pleased, including through piracy. She essentially told Rome that what happened at sea was out of her hands. It wasn't exactly the answer Rome wanted. And then came a fatal mistake. One of the Roman envoys, perhaps emboldened by Roman pride or just plain arrogance, insulted Tudor publicly. He accused her of acting like a woman, implying she was weak, emotional, and unfit to rule. Whether it was sexism, diplomacy, or sheer stupidity, that remark cost him his life. Not long after, he was assassinated on Tudor's orders. A decision that would echo all the way back to the marble floors of the Roman Senate. Rome erupted in outrage. Killing a Roman envoy was more than a diplomatic breach. It was an act of war, and not just any war. This would be Rome's first military campaign across the Adriatic, the beginning of its expansion into the eastern Mediterranean. Tudo had made her move. Whether out of pride, policy, or sheer fury, she had crossed the line. Now Rome was coming, not with envoys, but with legions. The queen had awakened the Republic's wrath, and there would be no more warnings. Tudor likely knew that Rome's retaliation wouldn't be small, but even she might have underestimated the scale and speed of the Roman response. In 229 BCE, barely a year after the assassination of their envoy, Rome launched its first ever military campaign across the Adriatic Sea. It was swift, organized, and chillingly efficient. 2 consuls were dispatched, with over 200 ships, a fleet that dwarfed anything Uria had seen before. This wasn't a typical raid or a border skirmish. It was a full-scale invasion. Tota, still ruling as regent and supreme commander of the navy, prepared her forces as best she could. But Uria, for all its maritime skill and fierce warriors, was a patchwork of tribes. Rome was a machine. The Romans didn't waste time. They first targeted the Greek city-states along the coast that had been bullied or occupied by Arian forces. Corsair, modern-day Corfu, which had been seized by Arian pirates, was liberated by the Romans and turned into a naval base. Apollonia and Epidamus quickly fell in line with Roman protection. The message was clear. The Adriatic would no longer be Uria's playground. But Tudor wasn't hiding. She sent her fleet out to defend the coasts, and Arian pirates continued to strike where they could. Yet the tide was shifting. For every raid they launched, the Romans captured a stronghold. The Roman navy, though new to the eastern waters, was learning fast, and they were ruthless. As Rome advanced, more Arian allies began to surrender. Cities that once looked to for leadership now opened their gates to Rome, hoping for leniency, the loyalty she once inspired. As the pirate queen began to fray, especially as Roman soldiers advanced inland, forcing a choice: stand with a besieged queen or survive. By the end of the year, Roman troops were within striking distance of Scadra, Tuteir's capital. What had started as a defiant act, a queen protecting her people's way of life, was rapidly becoming a siege. Tuteir now faced a decision no monarch ever wants to make: fight until the bitter end and risk annihilation, or bow to a foreign power. The queen who had ruled the waves now found herself surrounded by enemy sails. Her fate and delirious hung in the balance. For with Roman forces closing in on Scadra and her allies collapsing one by one, Tuteir's once mighty influence began to shrink like a receding tide. Her network of coastal strongholds, vital for resupplying ships and launching raids, was crumbling under Roman pressure. The Adriatic Sea, once an Arian dominion, now bristled with Roman warships. The Queen of the Sea had lost her sea, but Tudor was no fool. She may have ruled with defiance, but she knew when to bend, especially when survival was on the line. In 228 BCE, facing overwhelming odds, she did what no one expected the proud pirate queen to do. She sued for peace. The negotiations were humiliating by design. Rome wanted to make an example of her. They demanded she give up most of the Arian coastline, surrender key forts, and most painfully abandon her beloved navy. Tuteir was allowed to rule only a small inland portion of her former kingdom, and even there, she had to promise never to sail beyond a narrow stretch of coastline with more than two unarmed ships. Two unarmed ships. For a woman who once commanded fleets, it was a symbolic castration. The sea was no longer hers. The title of pirate queen had been forcibly retired, and the Adriatic now answered to Rome. But even in surrender, Tudor wasn't completely broken. Though her political power was gutted and her military reach clipped, she retained her title and remained regent for a short time. Her ability to survive the storm quite literally showed the cunning and realism that had defined her rule. In a world where other rebellious rulers were often executed or dragged in chains. Through Roman triumphs, Tudor was spared. Perhaps Rome respected her tenacity, or perhaps they feared turning her into a martyr. Still, her influence faded quickly. Soon after the peace agreement, Tudor disappears from historical record. Her stepson Pinez would eventually rule in name, though always under Roman oversight. Tuteir, once a queen with command over waves and warriors, faded into silence. But she was far from forgotten. In Roman memory, she was the first to challenge them on the open sea. And in Arian legend, she remained a symbol of resistance. A woman who dared to defy a rising empire and nearly got away with it. Though Tudor's rule ended in surrender, her legacy laid the foundation for one of the most critical transitions in Mediterranean history: the birth of Rome as a naval superpower. Ironically, it was her defiance that forced Rome to evolve. Before Tudor, Rome had been primarily a land-based power. Its military strength came from its legions, its politics from the landowning elite, and its focus was always centered on the Italian peninsula. the sea that was for traders, and Greeks or for pirates like the Irians, but Tota changed. That, the First Irian War, sparked by her bold resistance and the assassination of a Roman envoy, was Rome's first serious engagement across the Adriatic. It required building fleets, mastering sea routes, and learning how to occupy and administer coastal cities. This wasn't just a temporary expedition. It was an initiation. Cut didn't just anger Rome, and her fall marked a strategic shift in Roman foreign policy, from guarding borders to crossing them. Of course, she didn't do this willingly. Tutor's goals were never to teach Rome how to build an empire. She was fighting to protect her people's independence, to legitimize Aryan seafaring, and to hold onto her authority in a man's world. But like so many historical figures, caught in the gears of empire, her legacy would be written by her enemies. Still, one can't help but wonder, had Tut not challenged Rome, would the Republic have crossed the Adriatic so soon? Or would it have remained a landlocked empire for another generation? Either way, Tutor's actions had changed the map, and history, ever the trickster, remembers even reluctant revolutionaries. Tutor's story isn't just about pirates and power struggles. It's also about gender. She wasn't simply a ruler. She was a woman ruling in a brutal, male-dominated world where command was usually earned on horseback or through bloodline, preferably both. And yet here was Tuta commanding fleets, making diplomatic decisions, executing envoys, and triggering international wars. The ancient world wasn't kind to female leaders when women ruled. Chroniclers, especially Roman and Greek, often resorted to caricature. Cleopatra was seductive, Boudicca was wild, and Tutor, she was dangerous and irrational, at least according to Roman historians. Take Polybius, for example. He describes Tutor as a woman with a natural weakness of the sex. That line alone tells you what she was up against. Roman writers simply couldn't accept that a woman had provoked their republic into war and then held her ground for more than a year. So they chalked it up to female emotion, not political savvy. But let's cut through the ancient propaganda. Tuta didn't rise to power by seduction or scandal. She did it through strategy and survival. She inherited a fragile throne after her husband's death and managed to maintain it in the middle of political chaos. She didn't inherit peace. She inherited piracy, tribal rivalries, and hostile neighbors. And she wielded those elements like weapons. Was she ruthless? Probably. But so were most rulers of the time. Her execution of the Roman envoy wasn't an act of hysteria. It was a calculated, if risky, political message. She was defending Irian sovereignty the only way she knew how, by force. And consider this. Tutair wasn't overthrown by her people. She wasn't betrayed in a coup or murdered in palace intrigue. She lost because Rome had overwhelming force. That's it. Her people didn't rise against her. In fact, some of her followers resisted Rome long after she surrendered. Toyota's reign, short as it was, carved her name into a world that rarely made room for women in power. She stood toe-to-toe with the mightiest republic of the time and forced them to take her seriously, even if their historians tried to write her off. She was a queen in war, a ruler in crisis, and a woman who made the ancient world nervous. Though her reign ended in a humbled peace, Tutor's story refused to vanish beneath the waves. Centuries after her last ship was grounded and her voice fell silent, legend still whispered her name along the Adriatic coast. In area, her image transformed from that of a defeated regent into something far more enduring, a symbol of national pride, resistance, and feminine authority. In Albanian folklore, especially, Tuta became more than a queen. She was the defiant matriarch of a people standing alone against the rising tide of foreign domination. Her name was passed down not through dusty treaties, but in the oral histories of shepherds and sailors. Statues of her now stand in modern Albania and Montenegro. Bronze, reminders that some rulers outlive their empires. And what an empire it was. Uria, may never have rivaled Rome in size or infrastructure, but under Tuda's leadership, it held dominion over key sea lanes and coastal cities. She ruled during one of the last periods when Irian identity remained politically independent. After her fall, Rome began a slow, relentless assimilation of Irian culture, language, and governance. Tuda's surrender marked not just the end of a war. It marked the beginning of the end for Irian sovereignty. But while Rome buried her kingdom under provinces and prefectures, Tuda's memory survived. Her reign, brief though it was, became a rallying point for future generations seeking inspiration in the 19th and 20th centuries as Balkan nationalism surged, and countries like Albania began to forge new identities from ancient roots. Tutayer was revived not as a tragic figure, but as a hero. Textbooks praised her courage. Streets and schools bore her name. She wasn't just a queen anymore. She was an ancestor of defiance. Even in modern scholarship, her story continues to provoke debate. Was she a reckless pirate or a pragmatic leader forced to embrace piracy as state policy? Was she a tyrant or a woman backed into a corner by the death of her husband and the ambitions of an empire? Whatever the truth, Tudor occupies a rare space in ancient history, a woman who refused to apologize for her power and whose decisions, for better or worse, reshaped an entire sea. Her ships may have been scuttled, but her legend, it still sails. Over time, Tudor's historical reality blurred into something mythic, a figure half-draped in truth, half-draped in legend. And it's easy to see why. A queen ruling a coastal kingdom, commanding pirates, defying Rome, and vanishing from history without a clear end. That's the stuff legends are made of. In coastal towns like Kodo and Ulking, stories are still told of a queen who once ruled from a towering castle by the sea. Locals will point to crumbling ruins and say, that was too stronghold, even when archaeology offers little proof. She is said to have thrown herself from cliffs to avoid Roman capture, to have hidden treasure in secret island caves, and to have cursed the waters that betrayed her. None of it can be confirmed, but none of it has ever really needed to be, because Tudor wasn't just a person anymore. He became a symbol, and symbols are immune to conquest. Even the sea seems to echo with her presence. The name Queen Tudor is engraved on modern cruise ships, hotels, and cultural festivals. Writers in the Romantic era painted her as a tragic heroine, while modern feminists in the Balkans praise her as an early icon of female leadership. Albania, in particular, has embraced her fully. Statues of Tudor, often depicted with windswept hair and a sword at her side, now grace public squares. School children learn her name alongside Scanderbs, and yet the real Tudor, the woman behind the myth, remains elusive. We don't know how she died. We don't know whether she ever regretted challenging Rome. We don't even know what she looked like. Her image was crafted by others, often her enemies, and later reshaped by those who needed her as a legend. But maybe that's the mark of true influence. When your story refuses to obey history books, Tudor may have ruled for just a handful of years, but her shadow stretches centuries. She lives on in poems, place names, and whispered tales across the Adriatic coast. The Roman Empire that once tried to erase her is gone, reduced to ruins and textbooks. But Tudor, she still sails in memory. The pirate queen became something greater, immortal. Today, Tudor's name resonates far beyond the annals of ancient history. Her story has been adapted, and echoed in ways she could never have imagined. The cistern reminds us that even beneath our everyday lives, the remnants of great civilizations remain, waiting patiently, hidden just beneath the surface. Its transformation from utility to icon is part of what gives it power. It no longer holds water for emperors, but it holds meaning for locals, for travelers, for artists. It connects the present to the past without words or ceremony. A place once built in secrecy now draws the world to whisper its name. It is no longer just a system. It is a threshold to mystery, memory, and the unseen heart of a city that refuses to forget. Walking through the basilica system today, it's easy to forget how fragile it once was, how close it came to being lost entirely. The structure has no lavish entrance, no towering facade. It was never meant to dazzle. It was meant to disappear. And yet, it has survived earthquakes, invasions, neglect, and the unyielding march of time. But survival doesn't happen by accident. The system owes its preservation to a series of quiet guardians, not emperors or generals, but engineers, scholars, and curious locals who refused to let it fade. During the Ottoman period, it was unofficially maintained by residents who accessed it through wells and cellars. They may not have known its full scale, but they valued what it offered: cold, clean water, and perhaps a sense of mystery beneath their homes. In the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars like Petrus, Gillas, and later Turkish archaeologists began documenting the system in earnest. They mapped its columns, traced the origin of its marble, and began asking the questions that turned it from a hidden space into a subject of fascination. Their quiet dedication became the first steps toward restoration, and in modern times, it's the caretakers, guides, and preservationists who guard it now, maintaining its structure, balancing humidity, controlling algae, and ensuring visitors walk safely on suspended walkways, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a cultural and national icon. In Albania, Montenegro, and across the Western Balkans, she represents something vital: the fierce independence of a people who refuse to be swallowed by empires. Her story speaks loudly in a region that has known centuries of occupation, division, and struggle. For Albanians, especially, Toyota has become more than a queen. She's a symbol of national identity. Her legacy has been woven into the cultural revival movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, fueling resistance to foreign domination and inspiring pride in a pre-Roman Aryan heritage. In a world where borders have shifted countless times, where languages and loyalties have blurred, Tudor is a constant rooted in stone, salt, and defiance. Her name is found everywhere, from naval vessels and passenger ferries to sports teams, businesses, and even a women's football club. Schools teach her as a national hero. Statues of Tudor, sword in hand, and gaze set on the horizon, overlook harbors once dominated by her fleet. She has become the Adriatic's eternal guardian, a queen not just of the past, but of the cultural present. Her relevance doesn't stop at borders. In the broader conversation about women in leadership, Tudor has become an ancient case study. Her story offers a rare glimpse into female command in a time and place where that was almost unheard of. She challenges modern assumptions about gender and power in the ancient world. Her name is now cited alongside Cleopatra, Boudicca, and Zenobia, women who dared to govern in a man's world and left an empire trembling in their wake. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part, that a woman so poorly documented by her contemporaries, remembered mostly through the insults of Roman writers, now stands tall as a figure of empowerment, sovereignty, and bold resistance. Tudor ruled for only a few stormy years, but her name has weathered centuries, and in every port that still remembers her, every story whispered to a child about the queen who defied Rome, Tudor sails on, not in warships, but in memory. The sea was her kingdom, and the story her lasting throne. 1803, the United States pulled off one of the most astonishing real estate deals in history. With the stroke of a pen and the exchange of $15 million, President Thomas Jefferson bought a colossal piece of land from France, the Louisiana Territory. This wasn't a few acres outside New Orleans. This was over 800,000 square miles of uncharted wilderness stretching from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains and beyond. Jefferson was thrilled. The land would ensure room for westward expansion and secure control over vital trade routes. But there was one small problem. Nobody really knew what was out there. Maps were vague. Rumors swirled about giant mountains, woolly mammoths, a mythical northwest passage to Asia and river systems that could either carry you to the Pacific or nowhere at all. Jefferson needed answers and fast. He wanted to turn that blank map into something tangible, something real. So he devised a plan. Send a small, elite team west to explore the new territory, chart its geography, establish relations with native tribes, and ideally find a direct water route to the Pacific Ocean. For this unprecedented task, Jefferson turned to Meriwether Lewis, his personal secretary, a former Army captain, and someone with an insatiable curiosity for science and nature. Lewis, in turn, chose William Clark, an old friend, military veteran, and skilled outdoorsman to co-lead the journey. The pair had different personalities. Lewis was introspective and intense, while Clark was steady, practical, and social. But together they balanced each other perfectly. Their mission was to gather information, not to conquer. They were to take notes on everything: animals, plants, rivers, rocks, and languages. They were diplomats, naturalists, and explorers, rolled into one. But let's be clear, this was not a stroll through the woods. The expedition would carry them through untamed rivers, dense forests, scorching plains, and snowy mountains. There were no supply stations, no GPS, no lifelines, just handwritten journals, iron determination, and the hope that the Pacific lay somewhere out there in the fog of the West. Thus, the stage was set. A young nation had bought a vast mystery, and two men were about to step into it, armed with nothing but their courage and a mandate from the president. As the tour ends and you climb the steps back toward daylight, the spell doesn't quite break. You emerge into the sound of cars and footsteps, into sunshine and the smell of roasted chestnuts. But part of you stays behind. Part of you still hears the dripping water, still sees the flicker of gold light on ancient stone. The Basilica system is not just a relic. It is a reminder that beneath every empire, every city, every story, there is something deeper, something older, something waiting in the dark. Still waters run deep, they say, and in the heart of Istanbul, they echo forever.